It's terrible that after 50 years, it is behind closed doors.
Her face tightened as the reality sank in. The complaint had already passed beyond defense, beyond explanation, beyond appeal. Charles had not brought her there so she could fight for her privileges. He had brought her there to witness their removal. Then he revealed another devastating detail. William had been informed before she was. The future king knew the direction of the decision, while Camilla still believed she might yet influence it. That knowledge left her feeling isolated inside the very household where she had once expected protection. Spencer had forced the wound open. William had been positioned inside the future. Charles had signed away the present. Camilla rose without asking another question. Charles did not stop her, because stopping her would not erase the signature. The confrontation had laid bare the pain, but not yet the machinery behind it. And as Camilla walked out without looking back, the story shifted from emotion to power. The palace machine, so often hidden behind velvet and ritual, began to show itself. The most brutal palace decisions are rarely the work of one person alone. They are shaped by private secretaries, legal advisors, senior royals, and the dead weight of history. Charles signed the order, but by the time the pen touched the paper, the decision had already moved through a hidden network of influence. Spencer may have ignited the issue, but others made sure the flame did not die. Charles understood that the recommendation had grown stronger than his personal feelings. A palace advisory group, in simple terms, is a small trusted circle of senior voices and officials who review sensitive royal matters before they reach the monarch. This group framed the reduction of Camilla's rights as essential to preserving the monarchy's future credibility. Credibility matters because it is the invisible force that keeps royal authority standing even in moments of private scandal. If the public came to believe the palace let personal loyalty override judgment, the crown would appear weak. And if Charles ignored the warning, the revolt would not disappear. It would deepen. William's quiet agreement altered the atmosphere around the king in a profound way. He did not need to dominate the room to shape the outcome. His position as future monarch gave the recommendation moral force, because the issue was no longer only about Camilla's current standing. It had become about succession, public trust, and the kind of institution William would inherit. A private note from the prince, preserved in a documented household account, reportedly stated that the future of the crown could not rest on unresolved resentment. That sentence pushed Charles closer to action because it tied Spencer's complaint directly to the next generation's stability. A senior courtier watched Charles reread the phrase ceremonial limitation and saw regret tighten across his face. A ceremonial limitation is a formal restriction on someone's role, access, or precedence during official royal occasions. The phrase sounded measured, almost gentle, but everyone in the room understood its true force. It would shrink Camilla's reach. It would shield the palace from further accusations. It would also wound the woman Charles had spent years working to fully install in royal life. Spencer waited for confirmation in a nearby residence, but he reportedly felt no triumph. What he felt was the crushing weight of Diana's memory pressing into the present. He had started the chain with his complaint, yet he understood that no official order could erase old grief. What his intervention had done was force the palace to confront what it had spent years trying to manage quietly: the emotional cost of allowing ceremonial power to drift too close to unresolved history. The legal advisors then delivered the final warning. If Charles later reversed the order, he would appear indecisive, and the deeper divisions inside the household would become impossible to hide. It left the king with no painless escape. If he acted, Camilla would suffer. If he failed to act, the monarchy would suffer. So Charles acted. Spencer's complaint, William's note, the advisory warning, and the legal pressure all converged into one controlled sentence of royal power. The order took effect, and from that moment on, Camilla would stop experiencing it as language on a page and start feeling it as a barrier in daily life. The first sign of her reduced power did not arrive through a grand public statement. It arrived at a door she had passed through many times before. This time, a palace officer quietly stepped forward, visibly uncomfortable, and explained that access had changed. In that instant, the abstract language of queenly rights became something physical, humiliating, and impossible to ignore. Camilla froze with her hand near the door handle, and the silence surrounding her was almost unbearable. The restricted ceremonial planning room was a private palace space where approved royals and senior staff reviewed sensitive arrangements before formal events. That mattered because these rooms are about far more than logistics. They are about trust. They determine who gets early knowledge, who helps shape ceremonial order, and who stands close enough to influence the monarchy before the public sees the final picture. As queen consort, Camilla had once entered without a second thought. Now, that same door required permission. The palace officer lowered his voice as he explained that access now needed direct authorization from Charles's office. That detail cut deeper than a routine refusal. It meant the restriction was active, not symbolic. It meant her role had been reduced in practice, not just in theory. Two aides standing nearby avoided looking at her, and their silence carried the humiliation she could not allow herself to show. Camilla did not argue. She knew anger would only make the scene larger, and pride demanded that she absorb the blow without leaving the corridor with a spectacle to remember. Charles heard about the encounter later, and when the report reached him, he reportedly closed his eyes. He had known the order would wound her, but anticipating pain is not the same as hearing that it has happened. His decision had now crossed from private authority into palace awareness, staff whispers, and changed behavior. That mattered because royal power often survives through habit. Once staff begin treating someone differently, the old position is already gone. It was, in every sense, a shocking turn for a story that had spent decades simmering behind palace walls. After half a century of silence, the matter did not explode into a dramatic shouting match or a public meltdown. Instead, the palace went still, and in that heavy quiet, King Charles was left facing a choice few believed he would ever make, removing key queenly privileges from Camilla after a revolt inside the royal household rose all the way to the throne. What began as murmurs of frustration had now hardened into a full royal fracture, and at the center of it all was Earl Spencer, bringing Diana's memory back into the room with devastating force. Charles reportedly read the final recommendation alone, and the stillness around him carried more weight than any accusation. His hand stayed on the page, yet he hesitated before moving it. He knew exactly what one signature would do. It would hurt Camilla, deepen divisions inside the household, and confirm that the internal uprising had moved past quiet repair. These queenly rights were not about making laws or ruling by decree. They were the ceremonial privileges, the access, the precedence, and the private influence that shape how royal authority is experienced beside the monarch. Everything changed when Earl Spencer stepped in, because his complaint did not arrive as ordinary palace criticism. It arrived carrying Diana's shadow. His sealed memorandum transformed private resentment into something far more dangerous, tying the matter to public trust, institutional memory, and the old wound the monarchy has never truly managed to seal. A memorandum, in this context, is a formal internal document used to explain concern, warning, or decision within an institution. What made this one explosive was that it showed multiple senior palace figures were backing Spencer's complaint. It was no longer a family grievance. It had become a palace rebellion. Camilla was informed in a private sitting room, and before the senior aide had even finished speaking, her expression had already hardened. That setting mattered. A private sitting room is one of the smaller royal spaces used for personal meetings away from public formality, and that made the moment feel less like spectacle and more like intimate removal. She was told that her access to certain state privileges, her advisory influence, and her senior ceremonial precedence had already been reduced. State privileges are the special permissions linked to official royal duties, while ceremonial precedence is the ranking order that determines who is recognized, who enters first, and who stands where during formal events. She understood immediately that the decision had already passed the point of challenge. Charles had signed the order without giving her a final chance to plead her case. That was the detail that landed hardest. He had not simply wavered and then surrendered to pressure. He had acted. Spencer may have forced the issue to the surface, but it was Charles who let the ink fall. And as Camilla sat there, frozen beneath the weight of the words, the palace's private pain began to look very much like public power. Every royal crisis comes dressed in official phrases, documents, and carefully chosen language. But this one had human faces all over it. Charles was caught between duty and devotion. Camilla suddenly found herself exposed inside the very institution that had once shielded her. Earl Spencer moved through the crisis with Diana's memory in hand like a velvet-covered blade, and Prince William watched the monarchy tremble as old pain returned not as memory alone, but as judgment. Charles sensed the room around him had changed before anyone said a word. As monarch, his responsibility was to protect palace stability, because the monarchy survives only when its rules appear stronger than personal loyalties. As a husband, he knew Camilla would feel humiliated, diminished, perhaps even abandoned by the one man she had believed would always protect her. Palace stability, put plainly, means the royal household's ability to function without internal conflict, destroying public confidence, or weakening authority. That was what made the restrictions so serious. They were not just about Camilla's role. They were about whether the crown could still command order when private loyalties collided with public memory. Camilla removed her reading glasses slowly after hearing the decision. At first, she did not argue. She sat in stunned silence for several long seconds, letting the meaning settle. Over the years, the queen consort had worked steadily to secure her place within the palace's formal life, and now that place had narrowed in one authorized stroke. Her dignity remained, her title remained, but her influence had been challenged, and the shield around that title had visibly cracked. That was why the silence hurt more than any raised voice ever could. Earl Spencer's presence in the crisis carried a force palace courtiers could not casually brush aside. As Diana's brother, his authority came not just from rank, but from unfinished history, from the pain still bound to his sister's memory, and from the public emotion the monarchy has never fully escaped. His revolt was not presented as revenge. He framed it as a demand that the institution finally stop pretending the emotional damage of its past decisions no longer mattered. By placing Diana's name back at the center of royal judgment, he forced Charles to confront just how dangerous the situation could become. William, for his part, reportedly chose his words with extreme care in private conversations with the king. He understood that every silence, every hesitation, every signal of support would help define the kind of reign people already imagined for him. He did not advocate cruelty. He defended limits. Palace aides had discovered that Spencer's complaint gained real momentum after several staff members submitted private concerns about Camilla's influence over royal protocol, meaning the hidden rules that shape titles, ceremony, access, and precedence behind the scenes. Once those concerns aligned with Diana's legacy, the revolt could no longer be dismissed as one man's anger. The pressure closed in on Charles from every direction. Camilla needed loyalty. Spencer demanded accountability, William watched for discipline, and the crown itself required control. But the true ignition point was not a broad policy dispute or a legal challenge. It was one specific moment that turned private resentment into open revolt. To understand why Charles finally moved, the palace had to go back to the moment everyone later called the breaking point. It did not begin in a courtroom, a council chamber, or under the glare of public scandal. It began at a private memorial dinner, where one chair, one remark, and one excruciating silence changed everything. Those who were there would later remember the room seeming to cool as Earl Spencer looked across the table and realized Diana's place in royal memory was being carefully managed, softened, and edged aside. Spencer noticed the shift before anyone dared explain it. His name card had been moved away from the central family position and placed in a spot where presence felt more like courtesy than importance. A private memorial dinner, simply put, is a closed family gathering held to honor someone's memory away from cameras, speeches, and state formality. This one mattered profoundly because it was held for Diana at Kensington, a place deeply entwined with her life, her sons, and the public grief still attached to her name. Spencer knew seating at such a dinner was not decorative. It carried meaning. It revealed whose memory was being centered and whose grief was being managed. William saw the card in Spencer's hand and instantly felt the atmosphere sharpen. He understood this was no routine seating issue. A seating plan may sound simple enough, but inside royal life, it often reflects rank, relationship, emotional significance, and quiet power. Camilla's team reportedly described the adjustment as a protocol matter, a correction made for order and formality. Spencer saw something far colder. To him, it reduced Diana's family from central mourners to carefully controlled guests, and that sent a message no polished explanation could hide. He did not raise his voice. He held the name card for several seconds, wounded but composed, while everyone else waited for someone else to absorb the discomfort. William grew visibly tense because he recognized the old wound reopening in real time. Diana's memory has always existed in that uneasy space between love and palace politics, between public devotion and royal discomfort. Now, one small card had dragged that hidden struggle back into the open. The future king knew that if the moment passed without acknowledgement, it would only become more volatile later. A palace aide later admitted in a documented internal account that the adjustment had come from Camilla's office. That revelation changed the entire atmosphere. What might have been dismissed as a social slight suddenly became the first recorded move in what became the revolt. Camilla may never have imagined the gesture would spark such a serious crisis, but Spencer saw it as proof that her ceremonial influence had begun reaching into spaces tied to Diana's memory. Once Diana's legacy entered the dispute, the palace could no longer keep it boxed up as ordinary household friction. Spencer left the dinner early. He did not create a scene, because he understood that silence can become much sharper when followed by action. The next morning, he sent a private letter demanding a review of Camilla's ceremonial reach, her role in memorial protocol, and her ability to shape spaces connected to Diana's place in royal memory. That letter became the first link in a chain that led directly to Charles and Camilla sitting across from one another behind a closed palace door. Once Spencer's letter reached the king, the grievance was no longer quiet. It had become a confrontation. Some confrontations change a family, others change a throne. Charles and Camilla met without cameras, without advisors filling the air with explanations, and without the palace's old instinct to bury pain beneath ceremony. A single folder sat between them. Inside it was the revolt, the complaint, the recommendation, and the signature that permanently altered her standing. Charles summoned Camilla before the order became widely known within the household, but not before it became real. That distinction mattered. A royal order is an internal command approved by the monarch that changes how privilege, access, or ceremony will be handled. This one had already moved beyond discussion. The folder carried Spencer's letter, statements from staff, and the final recommendation restricting Camilla's queenly privileges, meaning the ceremonial rights, advisory access, and formal precedence attached to her role beside the king. Charles may have wanted the conversation to feel personal, but the folder made it official. Camilla understood the danger the moment she saw the papers arranged together. She did not first ask about seating, titles, or staterooms. She asked Charles whether he believed she had betrayed the institution. That question hit him because it demanded an answer from a husband, not just a monarch. But the only answer available to him was buried in the weight of what he had already signed. He paused, and the pause lasted just long enough for Camilla to hear what no carefully framed sentence could soften. He may not have used the word betrayal, but he had accepted that her influence had become a risk. Charles placed his pen down instead of reaching for her hand. That tiny gesture captured the whole heartbreak of the moment. The man who loved Camilla was still present, but the sovereign had stepped in front of him. A sovereign, plainly stated, is the reigning monarch who carries the final burden for royal authority and public trust. Charles knew that if he touched her too soon, mercy might be read as weakness. Camilla knew that if he did not touch her at all, then love had already yielded to the crown. Then the truth settled between them. The decision had already been signed. This was not a discussion. It was the end of a kind of authority she had believed was secure. Camilla's name, then, began quietly disappearing from internal protocol sheets. A protocol sheet is a working document that tells staff who attends briefings, who receives notes, and who participates in ceremonial decisions. These changes removed her from selected committees and planning sessions, once tied directly to her standing beside the king. Then came the schedule adjustment that made the shift even more obvious. William would attend an important briefing in her place. His presence signaled that influence was moving toward the next generation. As Camilla's reach narrowed, the institution began withdrawing from her one measured step at a time. Charles had signed the order. Spencer had forced the reckoning. William had moved closer to the center, and Camilla, once shielded by her proximity to the throne, now felt the palace observing her from a distance. Yet just when abandonment seemed poised to define the crisis, one private conversation changed its emotional course. After that first door closed, the next turning point came not from a document, but from two men speaking without titles between them. The palace may have expected anger. It may have expected retaliation. It may have expected Camilla to push back through every private channel still open to her. Instead, the pivotal moment came in a small room where Charles and William sat without aides, without prepared language, and without the icy shelter of protocol. For the first time, Charles was not defending a decision. He was admitting its cost. By then, the king understood the crisis no longer belonged only to his marriage. It belonged to the future of the monarchy itself. Access restriction, in simple terms, means limiting who may enter certain spaces, receive sensitive briefings, or influence ceremonial choices. That mattered because Camilla's reduced reach was now visible to staff, advisors, and senior royals, transforming a private order into an unmistakable institutional signal. Charles had delayed because he feared hurting her, and now, that delay itself felt like part of the injury. William entered the conversation carefully. He was not there as Camilla's adversary. He was there as the future king, determined to stop the cycle of buried resentment that had haunted the family for decades. He understood that unresolved pain does not vanish inside palace walls. It waits, it hardens, and eventually it returns through letters, seating plans, complaints, and public reckoning. Spencer had forced the issue into the open, But William knew Spencer had merely exposed what silence had allowed to grow. That was why he listened as Charles admitted the truth. He had waited too long, because love had made discipline feel cruel. William did not chastise his father. Instead, he gave him the gentler sentence, and somehow that landed even harder. He told Charles that protecting the crown sometimes means accepting pain rather than disguising it. The crown, plainly explained, is the monarchy as a living institution with its authority, trust, continuity, and duty extending beyond any one individual. Charles took in the words because they named the burden he had tried to avoid. Camilla's dignity mattered. Diana's memory mattered. Spencer's complaint mattered. But the palace could not preserve peace by pretending every wound had already healed. Then Charles made the decision unmistakably clear. He would not restore the rights that had been removed from Camilla. The restriction would not be temporary. She would remain beside him as queen consort, but the ceremonial authority taken from her would stay out of reach. William accepted that statement with seriousness, not satisfaction. He agreed to help manage the public fallout, but only if the palace acknowledged the emotional truth behind the revolt. It could not be sold as mere procedure. It had to admit that history had returned and demanded structure. Charles understood in that moment that his son was no longer simply offering advice. He was shaping the emotional logic of the next reign. The family may have reached private alignment, but it was not peace. And beyond the palace gates, the country was already preparing its own verdict. By morning, the palace could no longer contain the shock. The story moved from private corridors to front pages, from sealed rooms to breakfast tables, from whispered staff conversations to national debate. One newspaper front page reportedly captured the mood with ruthless precision. A photograph of Camilla looking away beneath the words, "The crown chooses memory." In that image, Britain did not merely see protocol. It saw reckoning. The truth reached the public in fragments, and each fragment only made the crisis feel larger. Charles had stripped Camilla of key queenly rights after a revolt led by Earl Spencer, and the revelation struck so hard because it fused personal grief with royal authority. These queenly rights were the ceremonial privileges, advisory access, and formal precedence tied to the queen consort's role beside the monarch. The public immediately understood what that meant. Her title had not been removed, but the influence that gave that title force inside the palace had been reduced. A crown can remain on paper, while power is quietly pulled away. Broadcasters framed the story as a collision between Diana's legacy, Camilla's place, and the monarchy's urgent need for emotional repair. Diana's legacy, simply put, is the lasting public memory of her life, her pain, her popularity, and her role in royal history. That memory still carries such force because it belongs not just to the family, but to millions who have long felt those old wounds were never fully addressed. Spencer's involvement gave the story moral intensity. Camilla's reduction gave it consequence. Charles's signature gave it finality. Outside Kensington Palace, a small crowd gathered in silence. Some held flowers. Others simply stood staring at the gates, as if the building itself had become a witness to everything the monarchy had never fully settled. Kensington Palace matters because it remains so deeply linked to Diana's memory and to William's public life, making it the emotional center of the response. There was no sense of celebration there. What hung in the air instead was grief, curiosity, and the strange feeling that history had finally pushed through the palace walls. Camilla watched the coverage from a private room and reportedly lowered the volume when Spencer's name came up. She could absorb headlines, but the constant return to Diana's brother made the blow feel even more personal. One evening presenter would later describe the decision as the first royal consequence that feels emotional before it feels constitutional, and the phrase spread quickly because it perfectly captured the national mood. This was not just about rules. It was about memory finally insisting on recognition. Palace officials eventually released a carefully phrased statement confirming a revised ceremonial structure. A ceremonial structure refers to the formal arrangement of roles, access, and precedence during royal duties. The wording may have been controlled, but the meaning was unmistakable. This was no rumor. It was now reality. Charles had acted. Spencer had forced the reckoning. William had watched the future shift. And Camilla had become the visible symbol of a deeply painful correction. Yet when the noise settled and the headlines stopped screaming, one question remained inside the palace. What had this truly cost? And what, if anything, had it finally repaired? In the end, the harshest royal punishment was not the loss of access, precedence, or influence. It was the silence left behind. Charles had chosen the monarchy over protecting his marriage from pain. Camilla had learned that power granted through ceremony can be reclaimed by history. Earl Spencer had forced Diana's memory back to the center of the conversation, and William had watched the future begin with a difficult truth. After the palace statement, Camilla sat alone and, for the first time, did not try to resist the order. By then, the rooms, the doors, and the altered schedules had already made its meaning painfully clear. Her role had narrowed, but it had not vanished. Royal protocol is the set of accepted rules and customs that govern ceremony, rank, access, and public order within the monarchy. What this decision proved was that protocol alone was no longer enough. Emotional legitimacy mattered now as well. The palace could not keep arranging people by title and expect the past to remain buried. Camilla still stood beside the king, but history had now drawn a boundary around her influence. Charles carried that reality with visible weight. After signing the final confirmation, he stood burdened yet convinced that any further delay would only have harmed the crown more deeply. The crown, in the simplest terms, means the monarchy as an institution, with its duty, authority, public trust, and future extending beyond any one member of the family. Charles understood that shielding Camilla from pain might have protected his marriage for a moment, but it would have weakened the palace in the eyes of those who still measured royal choices against Diana's memory. He had not escaped heartbreak. He had simply chosen the version of heartbreak he believed the monarchy could survive. When Spencer received word that the order was permanent, it did not feel like victory. He placed the confirmation beside Diana's photograph, treating the moment less as triumph and more as solemn closure. His revolt had never been about revenge, no matter how many people would call it that. It had been about forcing the palace to acknowledge that old wounds still shape public trust. Diana's memory was never just private grief. It had become a national measure of whether the monarchy could admit pain without hiding behind ceremony. William understood that lesson with a clarity that would follow him into the future. He recognized that the next reign cannot depend on silence, secrecy, or emotional evasion if it hopes to endure. The monarchy survived this rupture not by denying it, but by absorbing it. That was the brutal victory at the heart of it all. No one emerged untouched. Camilla lost reach. Charles lost comfort. Spencer carried sorrow, disguised as closure. William inherited a warning. In the end, the message was unmistakable. The crown chose accountability over comfort, memory over convenience, and painful truth over polished illusion. The revolt did not end in celebration. It ended with a monarchy forever altered, quieter than before, wounded in full view, and finally forced to honor a past it could no longer outrun. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to like and subscribe. We'll see you in the next one.